right, everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. We've got a double header today. We just finished a conversation, actually, and now we're joined with, Dr. Jim and I, are joined by Dr. Stephen DeLay.
Pat and I had a quick shower, and now we're back in, right?
Yeah, I got a quick Pellegrino, and we're good to go. So we're gonna talk about phenomenology today. We've been talking about phenomenology for a while, and Stephen and I just got connected through a friend of mine, and he seems to be the man for the job. Now, we were just kind of talking backstage behind the scenes, I guess, both of your history of how you each got into phenomenology. Now, I'm not going to have a whole lot to say on this because, Stephen, Jim has told me explicitly that I'm not even allowed to read phenomenology until I'm 40 years old. Is that true? Do you agree with that?
No.
For a recovering analytic philosopher.
Jim, maybe you want to say something.
I'm just saying, just for a recovering analytic philosopher, like if you started out right, it might be different, right? But I was not personally prepared until my 40th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because even someone like Edmund Husserl, who I think generally is taken to be the founder of phenomenological philosophy, he himself repeatedly said to anybody who would listen that he considered himself to be a perpetual beginner.
Yeah.
And that he was always learning more, always reformulating his thinking, that it was a sort of what you would call an infinite task, that phenomenological reflection never ends. And so I think that's in some ways a deeply insightful and sort of kind of encouraging thought that even someone such as Husserl himself thought that he was a beginner when it came to phenomenology.
Yeah.
And I would just say that I think it's precisely that makes, in some ways, phenomenological philosophy so uniquely accessible that anyone who is willing to just reflect carefully on experience and what it is that's being presented or given to them is already, in a way, poised to enter into the phenomenological world.
Yeah.
And I want to, I think there's a really, it has nothing to do with what you said, Stephen, but there's a really wrong track the conversation can go on right there, that when you're dealing with people who come from, say, an analytic background, even like a traditionally Thomistic background, it can go on, right? Because when you say experience there, you don't mean anything like sense data, okay? You don't mean anything like narrowly construed sensory input or Kantian intuition, right? I take it what you mean is, by experience, is how we encounter things in the ordinary life world, right? And taking that very, very seriously and asking ourselves, like, what conditions for that we can deduce from what the content of that experience, right?
Yeah, that's precisely correct.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that I might say in response to what you just mentioned. Let me. You had mentioned analytic philosophy, so maybe that's one way to frame the discussion. Think about, for example, someone like Patricia Churchland or even Dan Dennett, a sort of analytic philosopher, might say a naturalist or a materialist of some sort, who thinks that ultimately mental life or mentality as such is in some sense ultimately reducible to, if not strictly equivalent with, brain activity or some sort of neurochemical process. From that perspective, you have what's called folk psychology, which is a sort of pejorative term for what people like Churchland and others think everyday people take to be the nature of our mental lives, but which is in some sense deeply misleading. In that respect, it's almost a sort of Wittgensteinian point, right? When Wittgenstein says that the surface grammar of our statements can be deeply misleading because they might suggest that the world ontologically is structured in a way in which it really isn't. Well, here again, so likewise with the mental. Churchland and Dennett think that we have this vocabulary, beliefs and intentions and desires, that suggests that a picture of the mental that isn't really genuinely representative of what's really going on. Now, against that sort of general critique of folk psychology, in other words, in the name of first-person experience, phenomenological philosophy wants to say, well, the ultimate court of appeal when it comes to deciding what the nature of mentality is, but not only the nature of mentality or the nature of consciousness, because it's not supposed to be a subjectivism, it's goes to your point about sense data, is the nature of reality is what is displayed. And any sort of theory we might want to develop about what the origins of our experience are, or how it fits within the natural world, or any of these other sorts of questions, are all secondary or derivative from what you would call the life world, which is Husserl's term of art for the world of experience. And so for the phenomenological perspective, the world of experience, the world of everyday life, is the world.
Right.
Someone like Merleau-Ponty makes this famous in the Phenomenology of Perception when he talks about the world of perception being the world. The world is perceivable. It's what's so contrary to maybe to the British empiricists like Hume and Locke, or some of the rationalists who took the experiential reality to somehow only be a surface, right? That was either caused by something out in the world that we didn't have access to, or some kind of realm of ideas that was higher than the perceivable world. The phenomenologists want to say that experience is reality, that appearances are real. They're not just mere appearances. And so this kind of fundamentally restructures the way that we think about the relationship between mind and world, and the nature of reality itself.
Right. What I find interesting is it seems both of you found an entry point to phenomenology, and it seems like maybe we should have just started with what is phenomenology, but it sounds like that's already being explained. So thank you for that, Stephen. But it sounds like for both of you, the entry point were issues you were having in philosophy of mind, which I find absolutely fascinating, right? Because like, Stephen, you just kind of outlined the broadly, wonderfully eliminativist position. Right. Like, which has always struck me as like fundamentally preposterous, that like, I don't even know how I could begin to entertain that as a possible way that things are. So I'd be curious to hear for both of you, like, what problem or problems do you think phenomenology helps to solve specifically when it comes to philosophy of mind and consciousness, right? Is it just external world skepticism, or how is it therapeutic, right? You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm.
So let me maybe give an example, and Steve, I'd love to hear your view on this, of what a phenomenological reflection might look like, and then maybe we can talk about what this does for philosophy of mind, right? And this is a very kind of Merleau-Ponty kind of example, okay? So that like your standard sort of traditional empiricist account of experience is that, I open my eyes and I look out and I see, some pink and some circular, and it's all these discrete atoms of experience, right? And then somehow we build up an experience of the world through an aggregation of these atoms, okay? And I think a phenomenologist is going to say, look, that's just not really how it works, right? Like I experience something not atomistically, but always involved in a network of other experiences. It's always a memory of something prior and anticipation of something in the future. Like, so when I look at the can, I don't just see a bunch of disconnected atoms. I also see the anticipation of what would happen if I turn the can around, right? It's not just the surface features that I'm experiencing. It's the position of that can and a whole world of anticipations and memory, right? And there isn't such a thing as this discrete experience, right, of the can. It's always the experience of a certain movement through time and space that involves me in this entire world of actual potential past and future. Does that make sense? Okay. Once you see that that's sort of what mental life is, this idea that you're going to start discretely mapping mental states onto brains becomes pretty silly. Okay, even if those brains are necessary conditions for experiences, you're going to see what it is to have an experience is to have a worldly involvement, not to have some kind of discrete atomistic event go on. Does that make sense? And when I, kind of started rethinking a lot of things in philosophy of mind, and I started getting into Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, that was a game change for me, right? To start thinking of the basic data of the philosophy of mind are not discrete atomistic occurrences, but involvements in worlds, right? Then meant the identification process that you get in contemporary philosophy of mind, or the obsession with what we identify mental states as brain states or something else, is a complete miss of how we actually come online as cognitive agents.
Right? I think that's entirely correct. In fact, you just called to mind an anecdote from when I was an undergraduate student that I think is relevant here, or illustrative of the problem within a certain strand of the philosophy of mind. I remember going to a professor of mine and asking him, well, how exactly do we individuate the mind states, right? What are the criteria by which we say, well, this is one mental state and this is another mental state, right? Where are those boundaries? Because, you read the literature says Jones is in mental state X, which is about Y, and you say, well, what's a mental state? Or, how do you know that you're in mental state X and this mental state's now ended and now you're in mental state Y, right? And the key, right, the turn here from the phenomenological perspective that sort of undermines that kind of cartoonish way of classifying mental life is the notion of a horizon. Mm-hmm. And Jim just mentioned it, talking about, for example, the cup in his hand. There's this famous anecdote about Sartre with Beauvoir in Paris, talking about how when he discovered phenomenology and the thought of Husserl was such a momentous occasion for him because he realized you could philosophize about a wine glass. Well, that sounds very French, silly, but there was something serious behind what Sartre was intending to articulate. I think one thing Sartre meant to say was that phenomenological analysis was a way of retrieving the real, the actual everyday experiential world, being in a cafe in Paris, and being able to say, this is real. The chairs are real. The tables are real. The wine glasses are real. This isn't just a world of appearance or mere appearance. These are things, and they have a reality all their own, independently. And yet consciousness, the miracle of intentionality, is that despite these things having their own identity, existence outside of us, we're still in contact with them. We're in the world. And this is a great mystery and paradox. How is it that we can be subjects for an experience or of an experience, and yet at the same time, our experience can actually be of things outside or beyond us?
Right.
And so so this goes back to the idea of the external mind skepticism and these other sorts of things. But a kind of fundamental insight or working hypothesis, as it were, of the phenomenological tradition is that you're not going to be able to properly come to terms with the nature of the relationship between the mind and the world if you think of the mind as a sort of internal cabinet or theater that is somehow being causally impinged upon from something outside of it, which is producing, for example, sense data or something like this. It's just a completely misconceived way of thinking about the nature of conscious experience. And so one impulse from the phenomenological perspective is kind of therapeutic, as you were saying, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, in a sense, not really therapeutic with the intention of dissolving bad problems. Phenomenology is also sort of in some ways notorious for thinking that there's a proper domain of philosophical inquiry, right? So this goes back to the question of philosophy's relation to the sciences. So unlike someone like Locke, who thinks that philosophy is just really the underlayer of the sciences, or a Wittgensteinian who thinks that philosophy doesn't actually deliver knowledge but just eliminates confusions, phenomenology, at least with Husserl, working out of this kind of Kantian tradition of synthetic a priori knowledge, thinks that there's actually genuine bona fide philosophical knowledge that is proprietary to philosophical inquiry. And this is what makes phenomenology so powerful and interesting, is that it actually has its own domain. Husserl considered it an infinite one, and then entire region of investigation that we have access to through phenomenological reflection.
So to kind of go to, I think, where Pat wants to go, like how does this sort of reflection answer things that we might hear from the Dan Dennett's of the world, right?
Right. Yeah. So let's let me set it up. If you because for right. Like people like that, right? Like most people don't want to think that the that like Dan Dennett's position is correct, right?
Right.
It's too preposterous. There's too much to give up.
Yeah.
But how do we go beyond mere assertion, right? Because it's one thing to just say, well, look, I mean, come on, right? Clearly, this computer isn't clearly I have conscious experience. You can't eliminate this without radical incoherence. But of course, the materialist is going to push back and say, well, no, we've come to learn more about the world, and it seems like everything is just fermions and bosons at the end of the day, right? So how do we get past the mere assertion of it at this point, right, and get it into an actual argument, right?
So basically what we're talking about here is you have these two images of human beings or human life, right? And to follow a kind of a famous way of putting it, you've got a manifest image, which would be like our self-conception that we find in our life world, our ordinary experience. Then you have the scientific image, right? The idea is the scientific image would just be there's just quarks and bosons, and then you've got the manifest image, which is full of sort of macro physical objects and persons and all that, right? And as Stephen mentioned, we pejoratively call that folk psychology or what have you, okay? And the idea is that these two are in competition. And the standard sort of naturalist story is to say that the scientific image is the ontologically privileged image, right? That's getting the world right, and the other thing's just fluff. Okay. Now, this is probably an example I've used on the show before, and I'm just stealing it from Herbert Dreyfus and Charles Taylor. But let's say we ask, my son Cormac to go to the next room and to check on whether or not a painting is hung properly. Okay. And what we're asking to do is to go over and, use maybe a level to come up with a quantitative piece of information, right? Something that's mathematically specifiable and would be a good, datum for scientific investigation. Okay. But note that he can only pull that off in as much as he already has in place, things like knowing how to work a doorknob, right? And knowing that if there's a meeting going on in the next room over, he shouldn't just barge in there and start playing with the painting, right? And he needs to know what side of the hallway to walk on, and he needs to know all these things, okay? And our very asking him to go figure out quantitatively, whether or not the painting is level, presupposes first that he knows how to get around with these other things, and not just get around. There's values, there's moral knowledge in this. You don't interrupt the meeting, all these things, okay? And so the idea then is, on the one hand, what we're saying is our ability to even frame the question that is information relevant to the scientific image presupposes our ability to get around in the manifest image. Okay. So the very idea of a scientific image that undermines completely the manifest image is incoherent, right? That even the scientist has to be motivated by something in the manifest image to take up the experimental attitude, and needs to be able to manipulate objects in the manifest world in order to perform the experimental procedure, right? And so you have a kind of value presupposition, a practical, physical contact presupposition with the manifest world, okay? And what is phenomenology? It is the way I like to think of it is it's the investigation of that manifest world, right? What are the absolute presuppositions and basic interpretations of reality that we build up, or that build it up, right? And to say that there is no reason to ontologically privilege the scientific image over the manifest image, right? And in fact, you may have to actually privilege the manifest image, because the scientific image no longer makes sense to us if we cannot bring it to bear in the manifest image, and vice versa. And so what you're going to get there, and I think this is a very Husserlian view, is you're going to get a dialectical relationship between the scientific and the manifest image. Is I need the manifest image to get the science up and running, but of course I learn things. That's going to affect how we think about the world in ordinary life too. So it's not like a dogmatic, naive realism. It's critical, okay? But I think the phenomenological attitude is to say that the life world, the manifest image, has a special kind of privilege ontologically.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a
that was good. Yeah, Steve.
It's a supervillain monologue. I'm sorry, but yeah.
No,
Steve, I'd love to hear. Yeah, if I'm getting that right.
That was brilliant. You said a number of things that I would have wanted to mention myself. You mentioned a doorknob. So I said I had an anecdote about going off to a professor of mine as an undergraduate and saying, well, how are we individuating mental states here? Not getting an answer. Well, another anecdote that would have come to mind is a doorknob anecdote. Because I remember in my first phenomenology class, which really began opening my eyes, you see, at the time, I was under the grip of scientism. I was an atheist. We can get into the questions about the relationship between phenomenology and theology later, maybe. But for now, just to keep on track with the philosophy of mind angle, I was a card-carrying naturalist, materialist, thought everything was atoms in the void, had no tolerance for anybody who took experience as legitimate. I thought it was all an illusion, right? And I really believed that. And so I didn't have to be persuaded that someone like Dennett or Dawkins or any of these other folks were correct. That's what I just took to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in one of my first phenomenology classes, the instructor trying to explain Heidegger, trying to explain what Heidegger meant by being in the world, trying to explain how Heidegger took himself to be undermining a certain kind of Cartesian conception of the relationship between the mind and the world, how Heidegger was trying to undermine the traditional problem of external world skepticism, and how Heidegger was doing this through his conception of practicality or the ready at hand, the idea that, as Jim was saying, our first encounter with the world is the practical things around us and the situation that we're in, right? When we ask ourselves, where are we? We're not in some sort of Cartesian geometric space, right? Not ultimately, or not even primordially or fundamentally. First of all, we're in a situation, a human situation, and there's all sorts of things that define that as a situation that transcend a merely objective geometric account.
Is the next village over 5 kilometers, or the time it takes to smoke a pipe?
Right. So exactly.
And which one's the privilege? Yeah.
So when it comes to proximity or distance, the phenomenological analysis is that something can be very near to me, even if geographically it's far. So, for example, if my wife is on a trip and she's 3,000 miles away, she can instill some sense, and not just metaphorically, this is experientially the case. And so the phenomenological insight is that's decisive for the philosophical disagreement. We don't just get to wave our hands and say, well, that's a metaphor. No, this is very familiar. This is real. We all know this, right? So
it's a demand for an argument as to why is the quantitative understanding of space ontologically privileged over the phenomenological understanding of space, right? Just except for that the quantitative is good for making nuclear weapons. Okay, we get that, right? Okay, but why is that the right rock bottom description of the world, right?
Well, so you're right. I think you made the presuppositional argument or the self-refutation argument, the incoherence argument. Ultimately, and you find this in Husserl and Heidegger and others, Merleau-Ponty, the idea that to speak of conditions of possibility, because there's a transcendental element to the philosophical inheritance in phenomenology, the very possibility of posing a question or of answering a question demands a way of knowing whether we're correct or not. And the standards of correctness are ultimately experiential. So this is actually the thing you get out of Husserl in Ideas 1, which is a text from around 1913, which scholars take to be the sort of moment when he becomes an idealist of a certain kind, whereas before Husserl had been a sort of straightforward kind of realist of another type. But the point Husserl makes in the opening pages of Ideas 1, and here he's talking to psychologists and neo-Kantians and others from this sort of German university system, is that actually when it comes to who's the positivist or who's the verificationist, who's the empiricist, he says it's we phenomenologists. That is, we're the positivists in a sense. Why? Well, he thinks it has to do with something about the structure of consciousness itself and the experience of truth and the relationship between experience and judgment and the sort of normative standards, the phenomenon of meaning. So, for example, you use the case of, say, tell your son to go into the other room and adjust the painting. Well, again, how will he do that? Well, he has to know what a painting is. Right. He has to know what you mean by your statement. And so he'll go into the room, and so there's going to be some kind of eidetic or necessary relationship between the statement you make, his understanding of that statement, and the reference or the state of affairs to which that statement makes reference.
And the holism is important, right? There's no knowing what a painting is without knowing all this other cultural stuff. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And that's why it drags, like there's no just one thought. There's always a world of thoughts, right?
And to make the point about why reductionism doesn't work, why it's incoherent in the way that you were suggesting, is that if I ask myself, well, how do I adjust the painting? Well, I have to know what a painting is, and this is all ultimately a holistic environment that Heidegger would want to emphasize. But the whole point is that even if I want to reduce that nexus of intelligibility away and say, well, it's all just subjective experience, and really there's only atoms in the void, and so on and so forth, the place by which I begin that entire analysis is in the room.
Right.
Is in reference to all the things around me. So there's a kind of paradox involved in reductionism, because you end up positing certain things that you ultimately try to, at the end, say don't exist. But then the question is, well, where did your analysis begin if you've explained everything away? You ultimately have to appeal to the reality of the things that you're intending to eliminate.
Yep.
Right.
Oh, sorry, Pat. Go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, just to summarize some of the lines of thought here so far. So Jim and Steve, you're both arguing, I think, quite convincingly that a reductionist worldview is going to reduce itself to incoherence ultimately. And it seems like so far that the argument in favor of that worldview is that it helps us build things and get places, right? And it's like,
exactly.
if that's so, it's useful as a technological method, but as far as why we should privilege that as a metaphysical worldview, that seems like a pretty weak argument so far, right?
And Heidegger, maybe we'll go back to this in a minute, but like Heidegger would point out that our privileging of that for technological reasons is not likely to work out well for us in the long run. But one of my favorite examples to make many of these same points, Stephen, it's from you'll probably know which lecture it is. One of Heidegger's lectures where he says, in your logic class, he's talking to his students, they give you like the example of a judgment or a proposition is this is black. Okay. And Heidegger says that's a proposition that exists only for logic class, and it doesn't actually exist in the wild. Right. So you think of it like, how often in your daily life have you ever said this is black or this is green? Right. I mean, only, like, to use Wittgenstein's point, only when something went wrong, like when someone is like colorblind, you might say, no, this is green. Right. Like for the most part, you'd say, hey, give me the green pen over there, right? Or, hey, I like the green one better than the blue one, right? The statement exists in a stream of life, and it only has real meaning in the stream of life. So like the phrase, this is black or this is green, in and of itself is actually really ambiguous. Like, what's the this, right? Is it, and you can only make sense of that because already I'm talking about a color, right? If you didn't have any language at all and I held this up and say, well, this is pink, right? Well, what do I mean? Do I mean the circular shape of it? Do I mean that it's a liquid? Do I mean that it's an artifact? All these things. Like, what do I mean by pink? It presupposes that we already have this background horizon of meanings just to use a single predicate, right? So Heidegger says like a better example of how language actually works is that the blackboard is inadequate. You can tell he's like kind of pissed because like the blackboard's not working for his lecture, right? The blackboard's inadequate. Yeah, it would be better with the German accent, right? But the blackboard's inadequate for the task or what have you. And so the black in blackboard only makes sense there because we're already acquainted with kind of like what it means to give a lecture or to receive a lecture, and we're all in the same stuffy lecture room and all of that stuff, and we don't learn what the word black means independently of that overall context, right? And so there never is just one thing. It's always a network. It's always against a horizon, right? And what reduction does is it ignores horizon. Right, it eliminates horizon, which that eliminates linguistic coherence. Right.
Just to mention something quickly, think about the really famous article. I believe it's like 1974 thereabouts. Thomas Nagel. What is it like to be a bat? Yeah. This was one of the first articles that, for me, led me to start questioning some of my naturalistic scientific assumptions. Yeah. So, of course, the setup for the article is this idea that we don't know what it's like to be a bat because we have no idea what that kind of subjective experience would be like since we aren't echolocators or something, right? Right. But I think just as equally interesting is to reverse engineer the problem and say, well, imagine if the bats were trying to speak about us and imagine what it's like to be us. Well, I think one way of putting Jim's point is to say that if the bats were to try to imagine what it's like to be a human, they wouldn't have to only try to imagine what is it like to have sense experience of colors and sounds and things like this and shape and touch. They'd have to imagine themselves into our situation, into our context. Yeah. Imagining themselves into that context or that situation involves a highly complicated, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, horizontal experience of history and art and music and science, of course, is part of it. But but science itself is part of our context.
Yes.
Right. That's all it is. It's just
that dialectical relationship. Yeah.
So we are in a world. We're beings in a world, and that's bedrock. That's bedrock. Not atoms in the void.
Yeah. A way that I put it in, this is an example I use in my new book, right, is like I'm even suspicious of the notion of qualia, the way it's used on both sides of the reductionist debates in contemporary philosophy of mind. Okay, because what it assumes that there's this thing like the tastiness of the chocolate that I can isolate out of the world and have some kind of access to. Okay. And I don't think there's anything like the tastiness of chocolate that you can give me that I can entirely recognize as that I can separate from like Christmas memories, right? Yeah. And I can separate from all these things under which that experience was like carved out for me in my own personal history, right? And a cultural history and all those things, right? So I think even well-minded anti-reductionists in philosophy of mind appealing to things like qualia, I think are actually falling into that atomistic trap, right? And they're still identifying mental content as these little pockets of significance, which I don't think exist. I think everything is networked against a horizon, right? An emotional, a cultural, a historical, a biological horizon. Yeah.
Again, you raise another fascinating and I think very important point there, which is just to say that we as perceivers, as human beings in the world, have our own history.
Yeah.
The historicity of the subject, right? So Husserl's way of putting this is he talks
and
about—
there's no experience outside of that.
Right? No, exactly. He talks about the process of what he calls sedimentation.
Yeah.
So he has what's called genetic phenomenology, which is this idea of the temporal flux of conscious experience over time, creating habitualities and associations that are uniquely yours that come to form you and constitute you as the unique person you are with your experience. And this, of course, shapes how you experience the world. It doesn't mean that there's a subjective gloss over it. It just means that there's certain things that you might appreciate as important that others don't. So given your upbringing and your experiences, if we're in the same room, we're in the same room, but the room will disclose different things to different extents depending on who the perceiver is. So again, it's not just only that things themselves are always experienced in context. It's the fact that this very context itself ultimately has reference to a subjective pull, an experiencer, a human being, a person who has his or her own historicity. And there has to be some kind of philosophical account of how that works. Now, the phenomenological point is that here today, we tend to think of that as maybe something that psychology would do, right? But Husserl's point is that actually, no, the processes that we today would tend to associate with psychological formation, as if it were just an empirical question, are themselves still necessary and eidetic. There's laws that would hold for any kind of rational being, if you want to put it in a sort of Kantian way, by which these mental states and things inform each other. And so this is kind of the phenomenological grist for the mill. This is what phenomenology wants to get into: is what are the laws at work, the necessary essential laws at work that govern our mental life, even in terms of the formation of the person.
What are the absolutely necessary conditions of any possible horizon of experience? Like what structures of meaning have to be there for there to be an intelligible experience for humans, right? I mean, I think that's really what we're discovering in phenomenology.
Right. One quick thing about it is sometimes the transcendentalese can throw people off, and there are some phenomenologists working today, particularly in France, who are somewhat uncomfortable with what they take to be the Kantian pedigree of a certain strain of phenomenology. So they push back against what they take to be a sort of kind of idealistic residue in phenomenology in the name of a kind of realism. But the point is, they're still always interested in essences and necessary truths. And one way to get at this from the phenomenological perspective is to talk about conditions of possibility. But the interesting thing about phenomenology, which distinguishes it methodologically from other kinds of transcendental philosophy, is that, and this is a bit paradoxical, the very conditions on the possibility of experience themselves must be manifest within the experience.
Yep.
So unlike the Kantian, which will, for example, will run through a deduction to try to derive the categories of experience and things of that nature, the phenomenologist is interested in ultimately grounding the transcendental account. What are the essential necessary structures of experience in the very experience?
Yeah.
It's a process.
Let me break that down for the listener real quick here. Is what Stephen's saying there is the Kantian approach begins with what Kant takes to be the absolute necessary conditions for any kind of coherent logical judgment, right? Mm-hmm. And it's going to like dictate what experience can be from those conditions. So the Kant is going to like attempt to discover transcendentally what are the conditions of experience, and then tell you what you are or are not experiencing based on that. I mean, it's unfair to Kant, but it'll work, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas what a phenomenologist is doing is beginning with common experience and then trying to, I'm going to use a loaded word here, induce, right, the conditions, right, of those experiences from the actual content of lived experience, right? And this is why I think phenomenology is always a kind of realism, because it begins with our contact with the practical world first. It presumes that, we're always already in a world, right? And works up to what the transcendental conditions are, not beginning in like kind of like a Kantian, like outer space and working down, right? And dictating what experience is, right?
Yeah, that's good.
There's a paradox at work though in phenomenological analysis. And you might think, well, if all we're doing is appealing to experience, then how is phenomenology actually showing us anything?
Yeah.
Ultimately, all it's trying to do is just describe what we already experience anyway.
Yeah.
And that's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
The Heideggerian diagnosis is to say, well, actually, there's something interesting about the nature of who we are. Heidegger wouldn't say as human beings; he would say as Dasein, like the kind of beings for whom the very
being is an issue,
or at stake. That actually we end up distorting in our own minds, as it were, what it is we experience, and so. The phenomenological imperative to return to the things themselves, as Husserl would say, is a task because, interestingly, it's in our very experience itself that we end up misconstruing what it is we're experiencing, partly through theories and ideology that we impose on our experience. So this is kind of the therapeutic element in the phenomenological method, is the idea of purifying experience, distilling it to its true nature in the name of what's really there, rather than interpreting it through some sort of ideological theoretical lens.
Oh, that's very helpful, Steve. I appreciate that. And the term purification was popping up in my mind, so I'm glad that you described it that way. So here's some questions, and actually Parisa has a good question here. Gentle listeners, if you have, I already see some good chatter here in the comment box. If you have anything you want us to entertain, please drop it in. But we touched on this lightly. I think it might be worth building on a little bit more. Parisa wants to know, what is the relationship between phenomenology and critical realism? And I even just want to add in also sort of like, what do you guys see as a sort of range of options between the different perspectives, right? So yeah, we're saying it's not a naive realism. It is a critical realism. But what is the perspective we could take on the scientific picture, right? Can we take an epistemic structural realism on that? Do we have to be pure instrumentalists, right? Or are those options just all sort of open to the phenomenologists wherever they think that the arguments or evidence leads, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, and I think this is probably a little more Heideggerian than Husserlian, right? Is I don't think there is, nor ultimately need there be, an ultimate kind of one-to-one hookup between the scientific and the manifest image of the world. Okay. I think being might be polyvalent, right? And there are different horizons on which we can have it come to fore for us, right? And the idea that we're going to have an overarching, horizon that accommodates all of them nice and neatly, I don't think we necessarily have that, nor will we get that, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean though, like things we're learning in science don't adjust the life world, and that doesn't mean the life world doesn't dictate what we learn in science or limit what we learn in science. But I like, one of the things I take from a lot of this material is that the idea that there's going to be a final description overall of the world that squares all these things together is not something we should be necessarily looking for, right?
Yeah, Steve, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, my view on the issue is unsettled. I don't have a firm opinion, for one, about the nature of scientific inquiry, partly because I'm not a philosopher of science. I have sort of intuitions. My inclination is I'm a kind of anti-realist. I tend to think that what's going on is that, and this comes, I think, out of
That's super punk rock. Jim's the same way. It seems
Yeah, yeah.
honest, but
I mean,
okay.
If you push me, I'm going to go pretty weak on the existence of particles, man. So
You
Well, I
just-
mean, this
grew up
comes-
listening to too much grunge. Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
This comes out of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, right? So Husserl has, and actually Derrida, when he first got into Husserl, it was through Husserl's analysis of ideality or geometry.
Yeah.
And so the idea is like, well, what's a geometric shape? Well, everything around us in space is shaped. But the idea of like the perfect triangle is an idealization. Well, is that in Platonic heaven? We don't know. The mathematicians argue about this, right? There's disputes within mathematics about the nature of numbers, for example. And the same thing happens in the natural sciences with physics and others. The idea is that you can't even provide a quantitative analysis of what someone might take naively to be an ontological reality without appealing to some kind of ideal structure, right? And so then the question is, well, where are the numbers in a world that's been reduced purely to matter, for example, right? So when it comes to the actual ontological status of the entities that, say, particle physics or other fundamental natural sciences are positing, I think there's genuine, open-ended, serious questions about whether or not they, in some sense, really exist, or what it means for them to say they really exist. Of course, someone like Putnam thought that the best argument for scientific realism was that it would be a miracle for the science to work,
Right.
unless realism were
miracles argument, right? Yeah.
right. I don't know. I mean, I find that line of thinking persuasive as well. But one of my reasons for just thinking we shouldn't take all these entities as, in some sense, existing in some kind of world completely independent of our own experience is that we formulate these theories through sort of abstraction. And so this is kind of Merleau-Ponty's point when he's talking about geometry, or Husserl too. The idea is that the sort of entities that this kind of scientific discourse posits or relies upon are constituted through consciousness themselves. Not in that they're projections or they're subjectivistic, but that there's a kind of ideality, right? The mathematical proposition that 2 + 2 = 4 isn't a subjective episode in my consciousness. It's not my truth. It's not your truth. It's transcendent truth, a universal truth, in some sense atemporal. So the point is that where do you take an entity like that, a mathematical proposition, numbers and things like that, where do you put those in a scientific worldview according to which all there really is matter? Can't do it.
So, okay, this I'm gonna get weird. All right, here we go. Let me make one more mundane point, and then I'm gonna get weird. Okay. Yeah, I love it. Right. Yeah. Pat's gonna draw me out. Right? But first of all, I think one of the things, just going back to a question that Pat asked earlier, is, what does something like phenomenological approach do for, say, your standard problems in the philosophy of mind? Okay, and I think this is a point of frustration for a lot of people coming from the outside of philosophy of phenomenology. It was for me for years. Is it doesn't do a lot for it, because like one of the presuppositions of phenomenology is that whole kind of like standard Anglo-American approach to these problems is just wrong-headed at the level of first principle, right? At the level of like what they're even analyzing. So I don't think, if what one wants is a resolution to the mind, finally the resolution of the mind-body problem, right? Brought to you by Husserl. Don't hold your breath. Okay. Brought to you by Heidegger, brought to you by Merleau-Ponty. That's not the point. Like, what these people are doing is they're rejecting that attitude to begin with, right? They're rejecting that at a much more fundamental level, right? To try to avoid, right? Okay, and I like the therapeutic model, because they're going to try to therapy you out of that that disposition to things that leads you down a pathway that gets you into things like mind-body
of
problems.
the picture that has held you captive. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Good bit of Wittgensteining there, right?
I
Okay.
mean, the idea is that you think of this scientific worldview, which is invading the life world. So Jim mentioned there's this longstanding question about, well, what's the you mentioned the manifest image and the scientific image. The question is, what's the relationship between the two? Right?
Yeah.
And on one view, and I think this is Merleau-Ponty's, and I think it's also Husserl's, although in Husserl it's much more complicated because I think his view changes over time. But the phenomenological perspective, in my view, is that the scientific image is derivative in every sense of the word, not just epistemically, but also ontologically, in terms of what is ultimate reality. So from the phenomenological perspective, at least in my opinion, I would say that the scientific image is in some sense nested within the manifest.
Otherwise it can't have any grip on us.
Right. And so if that's the case, then the further argument to make would be that in some sense, and I'm kind of, making it sort of putting in psychoanalytic language, but the scientific image, or the kind of slavish worship of it, the elevation of it, the idea that this is truth, right? That this is the key to reality, is kind of a neurosis. It's
on now, man. Here we go.
It's kind of a neurotic. It's kind of a neurotic.
It is neurotic.
Well, I mean, yeah. When you watch the scientists talk about their discoveries, there's definitely arrows there, right? I mean, so. Yeah. But the point,
and a little Thanatos too, I think. Yeah.
There's this idea that it has to be that we're anxious about just taking experiential reality at face value. Mm-hmm. That somehow the idea of being able to claim that it's an illusion, or that somehow there's some kind of ultimate truth beneath it that shows that what we're experiencing is just merely an illusion, has somehow for us become comforting.
Yeah.
That we actually find it comforting in some regard to believe that values aren't real, that moral,
to be disburdened of our humanity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
To no longer be docile. Right. To be relieved of the anxiety of being. Right.
Well, yeah. So you mentioned Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger's analysis of the problem, at least in the 1920s, when he's still kind of working within a kind of transcendental framework, he's still trying to mold his thinking more or less to Husserl's, even though at that point they'd already had a falling out. There was a radical disagreement between them. But at least in the 1920s, before the turn, and you get into the 1930s, Heidegger is convinced that there's something about the very structure of Dasein, of who it is to be the kinds of beings we are, that inevitably lends itself to our fundamentally misunderstanding ourselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, if there's a sort of, if ontologically, and by that I mean, if what it is to be who we are is to be a kind of being for whom the meaning of our being is at stake or at issue in such a way that the question of the meaning of being as such is the philosophical question.
Always fall short. We always fall short.
Then there's a kind of inevitable failure, according to Heidegger, where we need philosophy, he thinks, because in order for us to even get a grip on what it is for us to be ourselves, we're going to have to realize that thinking that that science is going to give us the answer to ultimate reality is a way of actually not being honest with ourselves about the nature of reality. Because the scientific account about atoms in the void doesn't answer the question about what it is that we were to do in response to that relation.
In fact, it masks the question.
Yeah, even if that were the case, there would still be the existential task of living a life in light of that knowledge.
Yeah.
Right.
So okay, this is going to go to that point. So, Stephen, you brought up Putnam's miracle argument. It would be a miracle if the science worked, and that's not how the world is, right? I like to, if not counter, at least juxtapose that to Quine in the Dogmas of Empiricism, where he says, really in his view, like modern physics is really just, it's on par with Greek mythology. It's just that what we're trying to do has changed, right? It's like the practical backdrop of what we're trying to achieve has changed. So if you're like trying to pick up chicks in 4th century Athens, right? Like Poseidon's the way to go, right? If you want to like nuke Hiroshima, right? Well, then, you know, Einstein's the way to go, right? And so what he's saying is like it's what we want out of this thing that determines an ontology for us first and foremost. That there's a value outside of it that we're bringing to it that's helping us, or you're moving us, right, practically to pick one ontology over another. Okay. And sure, it would be a miracle for the science not to work if it weren't true, but there's a lot of different things that can work. It depends on what you're trying to do. Okay. Okay, that's pretty radical, but I mean, but Quine, I mean, that is Quine's view in that classic article. Okay.
Right.
Now, and I want to hook that into something phenomenological. As Heidegger, you know, pretty famously says in what is called Thinking, that we didn't become technological because we made the factory. We made the factory because we were technological. Okay. And that fits with things he says in other essays, like on the question concerning technology, where he says, you know, basically we didn't become science. Like, it wasn't the discoveries of modern science that led us to become technological. It was our already technological attitude towards the world and nature that led us to begin to prefer a certain kind of very narrow scientific inquiry compared to the other kinds of inquiries that were satisfying to us prior to that.
Yeah.
Do you see that? Okay. And so the idea here is that we've begun to privilege the scientific image, right? Because what we are trying to do with reality has changed, right? It's not saying the scientific image is getting it wrong. Heidegger would say, no, the technology reveals entities. It shows us something that's there. It's really there. It's getting something very right. But we've become obsessed with that. We hold it on a pedestal as our prime, as the ontological bar now, because our attitude towards being has changed, right? And so I think, like, this is at least for Heidegger, I take it, like later Heidegger, I think we're getting here, right, is there's many ways being can show itself to us, right? And it's always a two-way street on like how we're receptive to it, what our attitude towards it is. And the reason that, you know, we're obsessed with this one very, very narrow ontology now is because of our obsession with control, right, of nature, right? And there are other ways that reality has been looked at and could be looked at that would not be that way, right?
I think the control hypothesis is certainly illuminating, and it's undeniable that that's partly what's going on. And I actually think that there probably is some sort of interesting interface between the Heideggerian analysis of technology as itself being a period in what he calls his history of being, and a sort of psychoanalytic analysis of anxiety and obsession and these sorts of things in neurosis. But I would also say, when it comes to what Heidegger calls Gestalt Framing, and how it is that reality in a way is being molded to fit what it is that we want it to disclose, right? The famous Baconian idea, right, is that scientific investigation is like an interrogation, and it makes nature cry out, right?
Or Descartes, to control and master nature.
Yeah, so this is what's going on with technology, right? So the quantification of reality, the idea that everything has to be quantified, leads to a sort of kind of bureaucratic managerialism, which then it leads to kind of this kind of technologism or technicism, right? Where
and next thing you know, everyone's wearing a mask.
Well, everyone's wearing a mask, and the idea is that all of existence or reality is reduced to bare biological survival.
Yes.
Right. So all value is completely disregarded. So now it just becomes about, this is the biosecurity state, right? Like Agamben and others have talked about this, but there's a really simplistic Heideggerian account of how this could happen. From my perspective, the really fascinating thing is how Heidegger's deep insight into the power of Das Man, they, seems to hold up so well when you have Heideggerians themselves who are going along with this agenda that Heidegger himself never would have gone along with, and they don't say anything about it.
Well, you know, okay, and also let's face it, like when you read the first division of being in time, right? And you get Das Man. It sounds like it's 1967, man. The man, right? Das Man, right? Don't do what the man says. It sounds like the most anti-fascist thing you could ever read, right? And then this is a guy who then like himself goes and signs up for the Nazi Party, right? But I think this kind of like makes the point. It's like Dasein always falls short. Try as you might, you will fall in line with the man, right? It takes constant vigilance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you know what I mean? So I'm not surprised when we see like contemporary Heideggerians, even leaving aside like, you know, contemporary academic virtue signaling and all that, and that's a thing. We can go into that, right?
But, it's a thing, right?
But like Heidegger's position himself would predict, right, that try as you might, even someone who fully understands this fundamental ontology is going to fall out of it and fall back into inauthenticity at some point, right?
Yeah.
Well, so it comes to a question of how do you know what you know? So for Husserl, to go back to the question, one of the issues with phenomenological analysis I had raised was that you almost might think that leading a phenomenological life is in some sense grandiose. You'd say, well, why just constantly reflect on my own experience? Why not just live it? And that's a really important question. Husserl's answer is that entering into the phenomenological life morally and rationally transforms you, and it's a simultaneously moral and rational transformation, because it thinks epistemically taking responsibility for what you believe and the basis on which you're forming your judgments is an ethical self-responsibility. So I think from the Husserlian perspective, you can kind of shed light on sort of what the danger of what Heidegger calls Das Man. Das Man is, right, this speculation of baseless, claims, right, that belong to, he says, everybody and nobody.
Idle talk, right?
Yeah, idle talk, just things we say, things we know. They're basically the functional equivalent of hearsay, public hearsay, right? But nobody's ever verified them themselves.
They say the masks work.
Yeah, and that's the Husserlian moment, right? The Husserlian moment is that it's built into the normative structure of conscious experience that when you entertain a claim to truth, it's deserving of what he calls a fulfillment, right? That it be presented or given, right? And that the state of affairs goes from just merely judged to actually intuited or disclosed. Mm-hmm. And that this is kind of the Cartesian moment, is that it's your personal responsibility as an ego, as a person, to take responsibility for that normative epistemic structure and actually verify what you take to be the case.
Right.
And it's
to hold one's Dasein over the niche, right? Like hold it over nothing and see if it holds up, right?
Right. And if we don't do that, then this is when we fall prey to idle talk. So I think there is a kind of way of a sort of kind of rapprochement between Husserl and Heidegger, at least on this issue when it comes to the nature of truth and judgment. The idea is that we shouldn't just offload claims of truth and judgment to society. We should take responsibility for what it is we believe.
Yeah, that's how I read a lot of what's going on in the crisis of European sciences, is that kind of rapprochement between Heidegger and Husserl.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly right that one of the criticisms of Husserl from Heidegger is that Husserl still is in some sense captured by the very philosophical tradition that Heidegger thinks has now culminated in technology. So from Heidegger's perspective, Husserl's still kind of working in this Kantian, Cartesian modernist perspective. And from Heidegger's perspective, the inevitable culmination of modernism is going to be this kind of technological society that we have now.
Yeah. And so, one of the things that has really fascinated with me, phenomenology, these last few years is once you made the point, Stephen, about, what it means to live a phenomenological life, or like what it means to really take it up. And you're probably getting a sense that I'm kind of like, as far as phenomenology goes, I'm kind of a Heidegger guy, right? Okay. And once you start to like really get what it means to look at the world phenomenologically, you realize everything in our environment that we have structured for ourselves is itself wrapped up with an interpretation of what it means to be. Okay. Like our way of making a living, the clothes we wear, how we transport ourselves, how like the appearance of our bodies, all these things are part of this equipmental environment that is itself an interpretation, right? It is an interpretation of what it means to be. And so nothing that human beings do as Dasein, as distinctively human, right, is metaphysically innocent, right?
Right.
All of it is an interpretation of what it means to be. And so, like, if you put the mask on, you are saying my interpretation of being is fear, right? Okay, if you, I mean, just using that, like, that going example, right? And I think that is like one of the real values of phenomenology. Is it is a kind of awakeness, right, to what is it in my what does my practical life say as an interpretation of being? What is the ontology that undergirds that practical, like, involvement with the world, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
And once you do that, man, it's a whole different world you're living in. It's a whole lot of questions that come up to you, and it's very hard for anything to go untouched in your life in a good way. Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. So, all right. So,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, yeah. Go ahead, Steve. Yeah, get your point in.
So to go back to the issue about why would someone have this anxiety or this urge or eagerness or even compulsion to try to explain away the manifest image in the name of the scientific image. Mm-hmm. And I had mentioned, this idea that, well, maybe we now are at a point where we find comfort in the idea that the everyday world is just an illusion and that there really aren't values in these other sorts of things. And I would say, though, another thing that could be going on, and I think you see this in certain science popularizers like Neil deGrasse Tyson and others, is that in Lawrence Krauss, for example, is this idea that science, the natural sciences, the hard sciences, if they're interpreted in this very robust ontological way, somehow answers to a kind of postmodern worry about skepticism or relativism. And so I do think that this is a kind of issue in phenomenology that Husserl and Heidegger were sensitive to, is that, and for example, in Husserl's work, in Phenomenology as a Rigorous Science, which is around 1911 or so, he talks about the danger of historicism or relativism. Mm-hmm. So from the phenomenological perspective, there's a kind of balancing act to be achieved here, because on the one hand, we don't want to go into this kind of scientism and naturalism and pretend as if experiential reality is just an illusion. But on the other hand, part of what makes experiential reality so rich and robust is its historical dimension. And so this does raise a kind of threat of historicism or relativism. And I think part of what's going on for the people who take the natural sciences so seriously is that they see it as the last bastion of any legitimate, credible, objective truth, because they don't want to take the road of relativism or historicism. And so I sympathize and empathize with that concern. I can see why somebody who wants to bar relativism, wants to bar historicism, might think, well, we're just going to have to go with this kind of very scientific view. Mm-hmm. The beauty of phenomenology, from my perspective, what captivated me and drew me to its promise, is that I think it kind of answers to the best of both without really falling prey to some of their errors. So it preserves a role for objective truth, transcendent truth. Everything isn't merely historical. Everything isn't merely relativistic. And yet we can bar the door to relativism and historicism without having to become a naturalist or a materialist and just pretend as if everything that we experience around us isn't real at all.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent pitch, if you will, for phenomenology, Stephen. I appreciate that. So here's what I want to finish up with, and we'll definitely do a part 2 on this, because we can always sort of scratch the surface in these initial conversations. But I think this has been a great intro. Where do you guys? Somebody's listening to this podcast. This might be the first time they've ever heard any of this stuff, right? What's the starting point? Where do you recommend people just continue their introduction to phenomenology? And then Stephen, you've got a number of books out, so I want to make sure that you get a plug in there. So make sure you also tell us about some of the work you have published and where you think might be some of the best starting places with what you've written as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, Jim, do you want to mention some of the recommendations first?
Okay, so my go-to kind of introduction to phenomenology, but it's bent towards philosophy of mind. It's called The Phenomenological Mind by, was it Dan Gallagher, and I forget the other person's first name, Zavi.
Yeah, Sean Gallagher and Dan.
Yeah, yes, Sean Gallagher, Dan Zavi. Yeah, I really think that's a great introduction, especially to Husserlian and Merleau-Ponty. And also, I have an introduction to my new book on my website that I think would a lot of these issues. I know it's like gross promoting, but a lot of these issues.
That's what the show's all about.
That's
Yeah,
right.
come on.
But a lot of what we talked about, you'll find framed in like a structured, rigorous way. The introduction is called the darkness of our times. Welcome to the apocalypse. So, yeah, right. And so, yeah, that might not be and there's lots of references in there to all the stuff that we've talked about today in the footnotes on that thing. So check that out. Yeah.
Groovy. And how about you, Steve?
Good. So I'll mention some secondary texts, and then I'll mention some primary ones. The primary texts I'll divide into two periods in phenomenological history. The first of which is what's now coming to be called classical phenomenology. The second period of which is now called the new phenomenology, or it's a phenomenological tradition growing mostly in France, which is now it's called the theological term. So as for secondary texts, there's so many. There's so many wonderful texts written. It's hard to select a few. I'll mention three. These were texts that were very formative for me personally, trying to come to terms with the scope of the phenomenological tradition. The first is Robert Sokolowski's Introduction to Phenomenology.
This everyone's first choice.
It's great, yeah.
It's a classic for a reason. It's wonderful. Just to briefly explain to the listeners why I think it's such a unique text, is that a number of texts take a kind of say a problem-based account or a history-based. They'll tell you the thinkers, they'll summarize the views. But the beauty of Sokolowski's text, I think, is that it gets you to see Husserlian phenomenology for what it is by actually inducting you into Husserlian analyses. So as you're reading through the chapters, you'll actually be learning all the basic Husserlian concepts, and you'll be learning what phenomenology is by actually being led to do it. So I think that's a wonderful introductory text, Robert Sokolowski's Phenomenology. A second text that I think is really good actually came out just last year. It's by Walter Hopp. It's an introduction to phenomenology with Rutledge. And it's incredibly rich and dense in text. It's challenging. It's a text that I learned a lot from, and I have to reread because it's challenging. But Walter studied under Dallas Willard, who was a prominent American phenomenologist at USC. And I think it's a wonderful text. It's focused mainly on Husserl, but it gives you a really wonderful overview of Husserl's career. And again, it's focused on the philosophy of mind and consciousness. So people who are interested in problems of consciousness and the philosophy of mind, highly recommend Walter's introduction, which came out last year. And then the third text is kind of a tweener. It's sort of in between Walter's approach and Robert Sokolowski's approach. And that's a text by David Sorbonne, which is called Understanding Phenomenology. And I really enjoyed that introduction because the opening chapter, again, like the Sokolowski text, kind of encourages the reader to try to engage in a phenomenological analysis for himself. And then after that, you get a nice summary of the so-called classical phenomenologists. So you get Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty.
Very cool.
So that brings me to the primary text. So your four main phenomenologists of the 20th century, the so-called classical phenomenologists, you have Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty. If I were to read a single text from Husserl's, it's difficult for me to say, but I would read Ideas 1 from 1913. Heidegger, he's notoriously difficult in his published works. I think he's actually considerably clear in his lectures. So I would recommend maybe just trying to putz around in Being and Time. And then if you're confused about what in the world is going on there, I'd say read a book that's lecture notes from that same period, 1927 or 28. It's called Basic Problems of Phenomenology. That would be a place to start with Heidegger. For Merleau-Ponty, the answer I think is simple. You just want to read his Phenomenology of Perception.
And that text is so much easier than people think it's going to be too.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I wouldn't read Merleau-Ponty until you have a grasp of Husserl or Heidegger, or you can try to reverse engineer the Heidegger and Husserl by reading Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty was heavily influenced by Husserl and Heidegger. He wrote a substantial section of the Phenomenology of Perception after having consulted what were at the time unpublished manuscripts by Husserl. So I would read Phenomenology of Perception. And then Sartre, I mean, Being and Nothingness, who's ever really read all of it, right? I mean, it's a really, really difficult text, but I would read Being and Nothingness. That's it for classical phenomenology. Then the more recent work, you have a number of really important thinkers. You have Jean-Luc Marion, who's at Chicago, Sorbonne. You have Jean-Yves Lacoste, Michel Henry, and Jean-Louis Chrétien. Chrétien died a couple of years ago. He is deceased as well. Marion and Lacoste are prolific. They're just always publishing. If there were a text from Marion I would recommend, I think probably I would suggest reading Reduction and Givenness, which is kind of the text that really exploded on the scene back in the 80s. This is Marion's reading of Husserl and Heidegger's analysis of the phenomenological reduction. Lacoste is lesser known, but he has a really wonderful book that just recently came out with OUP called The Appearing of, which is a collection of his essays he's written over the years. I think it's a really, really wonderful, accessible introduction to Lacoste's work. Chrétien was prolific. He wrote dozens of books throughout the years. He has a book that recently just came out in translation with Roman and Littlefield called Spacious. And I think that's a really wonderful book. So if anyone's interested in reading Jean-Louis Chrétien, I would suggest starting there with Spacious Joy. And then finally, there's Lee, who, again, was very prolific. He was a novelist in addition to being a philosopher. I think his best, most important book is I Am the Truth. Mm-hmm. But if I were to recommend a single book with which to start, I would suggest Barbarism, which is almost a sort of pamphlet that he published back in the 80s. And I recommend Barbarism because in some ways it's almost a prophecy about the time in which we're living now. So Henri was deeply concerned about artificial intelligence. He was deeply concerned about the loss of our humanity. He was deeply concerned with the loss of culture and value. And so in Barbarism, you see Henri taking Heideggerian and Husserlian insights about the nature of technology and the problems of naturalism and applying them to our contemporary society. So I would recommend reading Michel Henry, Barbarism.
That's excellent. Thank you. And last thing, Steve, how about some of your work? What do you have? You just have a new book that I know I got my copy. Is it officially out yet? Or just make sure you let people know where they can keep up with you and some of your stuff.
Right. So we have 3 monographs. The first one came out in 2019. That's Phenomenology in France. This is an introduction to some of these French figures I've just mentioned at the end. There's also an introduction to Husserl and Heidegger. So if anybody's interested in learning more about phenomenology in France, there's that book. My second book came out in 2019. That's this one, Before God. My understanding is that it'll be available in paperback next month.
Oh, cool.
There, I'm just sort of following some lines that have emerged out of the French tradition. And then the most recent book, the one that you just mentioned that I sent to you, is called In the Spirit. And that will be available for pre-order starting next week. And it won't be released actually till May of next year, but it's done. So that book is in some way a work of art criticism. Jean-Louis Chrétien, Michel Henry, they're all deeply interested in art, and they've written extensively on art. And so this book is a kind of my own attempt of doing a sort of phenomenology of certain artworks, but putting it in the context of the Bible and Scripture. So it's kind of it's a sort of phenomenology of religious life, but work that's simultaneously drawing on artworks.
Excellent. Well, hey, gentlemen, this has just been an absolutely fascinating conversation. We covered a lot of territory in a relatively short amount of time. I definitely want to make sure we arrange for a part 2. And I thank you both very much for your wonderful contributions.
Pat. Thanks,
Excellent
Steven.
stuff.
Yeah, thank you guys.